Monohybrid Cross. Mendel, during the tenure of his experiments, made several crosses of pea plants involving only one pair of contrasting characters or traits. Such crosses were termed as monohybrid crosses. We shall consider Mendel's cross of red-flowered and white-flowered pea plants as an example to study and understand the monohybrid cross. The parental generation P1, red-flowered and white-flowered pea plants, were used as parents for crossing, and thus they are said to be plants of P1 generation. Mendel used terms like dominant and recessive for red flowers and white flowers respectively. Dominant character is the one which masks or hides its recessive partner. Red flowers were called dominant because in the following generation all the plants were with red flowers. White flowers were termed as recessive as this character was not exhibited in the next generation. Mendel stated that the factors responsible for these traits were present in pairs. Today we call these factors as genes. Dominant genes are represented by capital letters and recessive genes are represented by small letters. As the genes occur in pairs, those for red flowers are written as RR and those for white flowers as RR. The pair factors or genes separate or segregate out during the formation of gametes in the P1 generation. Thus, two types of gametes are produced, one with R factors and the other with R factors. The following generation, that is, the generation produced by P1 generation, is called as the first filial generation or F1 generation. The first filial generation F1. Mendel observed that all the flowers of F1 generation were red in color. He realized that the red-flowered plants of F1 generation were different from the red-flowered plant of P1 generation, as the F1 generation plants had white-flowered parents. From the result of F1 generation, Mendel concluded that red was dominant over white. Though F1 individuals were bearing red-colored flowers, they contained factors for white-colored flowers too. Thus, the plants of F1 generation are phenotypically red but genotypically hybrids. The phenotype is the appearance or any detectable characteristic feature of an individual like red and white flowers. The genotype is a term that refers to the genetic composition of an individual. Thus, we can say that F1 red-colored plants are similar to P1 red-flowered plant in their phenotype but different in genotype. Red-flowered plants in P1 generation have RR genotype and thus produce only one type of gamete, R. The F1 red-flowered plant possess RR genotype and thus produce two types of gametes, namely R and R. Mendel continued with his experiments and allowed the F1 plants to self-pollinate in order to produce second filial generation F2. The second filial generation F2. The F2 generation has both red-flowered and white-flowered plants. Mendel found out that out of a total of 929 pea plants, 705 were red flowers and 224 plants were with white flowers. Thus, the phenotypic ratio is approximately 3 red is to 1 white. The genotypic ratio would be 1 RR is to 2 RR is to 1 RR, which is based on genetic constitution. Thus, it can be inferred that phenotypically there are two types of F2 plants, that is red and white flowered plants, but genotypically there are three types, namely A. F2 pure dominance, RR produced red flowers, homozygous. B. F2 pure recessive, RR produced white flowers, homozygous. C. F2 hybrid reds, RR produced red flowers, heterozygous. With the help of a table, show Mendel's monohybrid cross of tall TT and short TT pea plant. Mendel's monohybrid cross of tall TT and short TT pea plant is shown in this way. How will you find out that F1 generation has traits both for tallness and dwarfness? Answer: plants of F1 generation were tall. Tallness of F1 generation was different from the tallness of plants of P1 generation, as the F1 generation plants had dwarf parents. From the result of F1 generation, it can be concluded that tallness was dominant over dwarfness, but had traits of both tallness and dwarfness. Write the phenotypic as well as the genotypic ratios. Answer: phenotypic ratio is equal to approximately 3 tall is to 1 dwarf. Genotypic ratio is equal to 1 TT is to 2 TT is to 1 TT.